So, the other week I happened to flick through my review of the Shinobi Game Gear games. I'm not here to plug that video, but they're there should you find the urge. And it occurred to me that whatever system they are released on, the Shinobi games have always been some of my most replayed 2D ninja em-ups. So I thought it high time that I go back and revisit the black sheep of the franchise. I've not played this game in years, and my main memories of it are that the digitised sprites don't look half bad, and that it was ridiculously hard at a certain point. When the game begins, we are treated to an opening FMV which, for 1995, looked damn impressive. You have to remember that at this point in time, DVDs wouldn't be in perpetuity for a good few years, and we're a decade or so off YouTube. The setup is standard Shinobi. A rival clan has kidnapped our love interest, and our sword-wielding ninja is in hot pursuit. This opening scene goes on for way longer than I'd remembered, and watching it now nearly 30 years later, the amount of effort that's gone into it is tremendous. It also at times is just straight up funny. It turns out that our kidnapped victim is called Aya, and she's been taken by the baddest of bad dudes who wants to rule the world but needs the ultimate power, and we're the only ones who can stop him. Jumping into the first level, we don't take control of Joe Musashi like in previous games. Instead, Sho is our main protagonist, seeing us through the 9 various stages. It won't take you too long to get your bearings with the controls, which allow you to perform all the familiar moves we expect from the previous Mega Drive entries. However, now they are mapped to individual buttons, given that there are 6 we have to play with on the Saturn's controller. We can jump, swing our sword, block, and throw shurikens. Double tapping and holding forward will cause us to sprint, which will allow us to do a sliding swing of our sword, and tapping jump a second time at the highest point of elevation will result in a somersault acting as a second jump, which paired with either attack will be performed in a wide area of effect. Along with Sho, all the characters that you fight in the game share the same digitised style, and for the most part they look fitting with the backdrops of the levels. The first level, as with most games, is pretty standard with a few basic enemies dotted around to ease us into how the gameplay works. You'll mostly block your way past these shuriken based enemies, and before things get too difficult you'll receive this power up, which by golly does this make every sword swing an overpowered delight. The size of that thing! It hurts anything it touches and makes such quick work of the boss I couldn't tell you what his weak spot was. It only takes a few minutes to have cleared out the village in pursuit of Aya, but we were just too late. She's been taken to a secret hideout. So secret is this location that it seems to be playing on repeat on a TV for us to easily find. It's probably at this point that you're wondering, are we going to be treated to an FMV after each level? And I don't want to bury the lead in revealing that yes we do, and it only gets better. The second stage takes a nice change in scenery and level design by situating us in a vertically scalable forest. It was around about here that I noticed how good the soundtrack is, and if this soundtrack sounds different to what you remember, from what I gather, the European version had a completely different composition, which after listening to the US and Japanese release is way more fitting with the style of the game. This level forces you to explore the stage in a less linear fashion, and the use of double jump becomes pretty essential early on. We're also introduced to environmental hazards with breaking branches. You'll have probably noticed me collecting these little blue spheres quite regularly, and I'll be honest, it wasn't until I finished the game that I looked for the instruction manual and found out that collecting 10 of them will reward you with 1 extra life. If only I had known that at the time, I would have made far more of an effort to collect them, and I would have been less perplexed as to why after dying a few times, I had more lives in some levels than previous. Not to give away too early what I think about the game, but I actually gave this a run each evening over the course of 4 days, and not being the kind of game with save points, it's a starter game from the beginning, and on my 3rd recording, I took a little bit more time to explore this level and found an additional power up, which I think allows me to get a hit a few times before taking any damage, quickly followed by our old friend who takes up a quarter of the screen in one swish. Making your way through the level, you'll probably make a few leaps of faith and pull yourself higher by grabbing onto the base of branches with use of up on the D-pad, at the highest point of which we'll find ourselves on a bridge to face the second boss. Now, I know what this guy is supposed to be because it was in the cinematic previously, but he just looks like a giant biker to me. He's also pretty easy and goes down after only a few shurikens. But wait, there's a twist. He was only the sub-boss. The real boss are these 2 statues here and... oh. This one though is a bit harder due to the close range attacks, and actually did kill me on my first try. Second time though, didn't stand a chance. Level 3 is where things start to shift slightly. This is our first interior environment, and there is something about the scale of this level that just seems off. Everything's presented in a way that makes us look tiny, and it became really apparent how vertically close the camera moved to show's jumping height. We are also introduced to these green gribblies, which along with this thing, just don't suit the digitised graphics well. I thought the design and enemy choice for this level were completely out of place at first, and then I thought back to previous games where you effectively fight Mechagodzilla or Batman and Spider-Man. And with that in mind, it's actually quite a welcome change. It has something akin to the feel of the film Casson, if that's how you pronounce it. I wanted to avoid talking about every level in order, as this is a review and not a let's play, but I think I have something to say about each one of them, as they are all just as varied with increasing degrees of caution to the game's environmental hazards, and these really will be the make or break point for a lot of people, I think. After some more amazing FMV, Aya reveals the key to releasing the man's inner strength, which happens to be a woman's pure mind power, which together can create endless energy, which, if I'm reading between the lines correctly, means that she's after a little bit more than a saving from old Sho. Anyway, this tantric sex fantasy is cut short as Sho receives a painful slap on the bum, and everyone takes a non-health and safety compliant dive into the water, followed very swiftly by Sho, who dives in his full gear. It was about this point that I looked up who the actor who plays him is, and his name is Tetsuya Aoki, who is predominantly known as a stuntman, which goes some way to explaining how enjoyable some of these FMV sequences are. Then we got to stage 5, where I immediately was hit with a sense of dread from the opening few seconds of the soundtrack. I knew immediately that I had never made it past this level, having died and restarted at the same point countless times in the past. But that was a long time ago. I've finished Elden Ring since then. And oh, I hate this undiluted arse porridge of a minecart level. Technically not minecarts, but you get me. I was already a little bit tired by this point, so this marked the end of my second play of Shinobi X. The following evening, I didn't really fancy it, but after 10 minutes playing on Space Marine 2, all I wanted to do was give it another shot. So I did. And what was a real delight was that despite my last run being completely frustrating, I was genuinely looking forward to starting a game from the beginning. The minecart level was only a minor setback this time, and I had pretty much remembered where to jump and when to just sit still, and after nearly falling at the last hurdle, ran straight onto a platform and fell further than the furthest hurdle you have ever seen. This one really did take me a few tries. There should be an easy strategy here of just standing on one side of the lift blocking the whole time, however enemies start dropping bombs upon death at such a rate that you really can't stay stationary. Anyway, I managed it by the skin of my teeth, and I was done with the over-the-top pitfall level. I did get a bit worried at this point that the rest of the game would just be a stupidly hard arcade run, but this level was actually a breeze, and I managed it first time unscathed. The next few stages are easy with familiar settings that we have seen from the previous games. In particular, I really love the look of this city backdrop whilst we traverse the waterfront in the foreground. On the subject of which, if we know Sho can swim, this shouldn't kill you. This point in the game kind of marks the difficulty progression of each level as being inconsistent. There's a massive aggressive spike in the middle that then slopes off, and the majority of the boss fights are a walk in the park compared to the world's biggest freight elevator, so I was in real high hopes of seeing the game through to the end. And then I hit the final stage. As the plot thickens, it seems we are nearly out of time. Kazuma, that's the bad guy by the way, is nearly done with what I assume is extracting what is established earlier to be the woman's mind power, and we must make haste through the Missile Transport Road, which is what the instruction manual calls this stage. Now, you might think with a name like that this would be a road that transports missiles. Correctamundo! This level is an absolute pain in the arse, and mainly for one reason. There are more than one of these occasions where you have to sprint into a double jump and hide up in the ceiling cavity, and I don't know whether it was input lag or just my timing, but this did me in time after time. However, by my fourth run, I did eventually get the hang of it, and despite losing quite a few lives still, by collecting the blue spheres I managed to get most of them back, so I had a fighting chance when it came to Kazuma. I mean, that's what I thought. This guy is ridiculously solid, and he killed me 3 times before I had even figured out his pattern, or even where his life bar is. So what I managed to figure out is, every time you do so much damage to him, he'll drop one of 6 orbs, but you've got to get it really quickly, or he'll just absorb it and become Super Saiyan. His attack patterns aren't actually that complicated, it's just having the time to study them to be able to learn when to get out of the way and when to strike. I mean, that is until he starts doing super moves and summoning giant birds and dragons. It took 5 of my lives to finally get him down to one last orb, which is when it occurred to me that I'd been carrying around a Thunder Dragon power-up for God knows how long, so I let him have it. This unfortunately wasn't the killing blow I needed, but I managed to get in there moments after with a cheeky stab, and with that, Sho had saved the world and was free to let Aya unleash his manpower all over wherever she wanted. So I finished it. It took me 4 playthroughs and probably equally as many hours, but what is interesting is that reflecting on my time playing it, it really doesn't feel as minute of a time distinction as when you calculate it, and I think that really captures what is still so playable about a lot of retro titles. They were always designed to be replayed, and one of the ways to achieve that was to cram as much variety into such small spaces as possible, so by the time that you get to the end of the game, the beginning seems so far away from where you've been that it draws you back in. But just being from an era that comes with a certain form doesn't instantly make a game any good. I mean, I threw countless hours into Roller to the Rescue back in the day, which was perfectly competent, but it probably wouldn't make my top 10 list. Top 3, of course. So I think there's 2 ways to look at this. One is just the game in general, and another as an entry into the Shinobi franchise, and I'm going to start with the latter. I always thought this game sat lower than the other previous releases in terms of quality. However, upon replaying it, I actually think it's a pretty accurate approximation of the previous games, in particular The Revenge of Shinobi and Shinobi 3, just with its own art style. It's less elegant than those games. The use of digitized characters is surprisingly more fluid than most examples we have seen, but they do come with some preset stiffness, which is mostly noticeable in the boss fights or with enemies that are not frame captures of actual physical movement. However, there are some omissions from the previous entries rather than additional features. We do actually get the use to toggle our block and swing our sword freely outside of an enemy proximity, which makes you feel far more in control of our hero than in previous entries, and while the digitized sprites have a very obvious number of frames of animation, they do feel like they move more in the game world with less restriction and higher responsiveness than what we are used to with the Mega Drive releases. But we don't have the hallmark collection of ninjutsu to cycle through, and the bosses are mostly a bit rubbish and too easy. We also don't get any alternative gameplay styles that were present in some of the previous entries, such as the first-person shuriken game from the Master System arcade port, or the horse riding or surfing stages from number 3. Though having said that, those additions were never amazing, and with each generation the Shinobi franchise has taken a different turn. The Master System entry was going for an arcade perfect port, the Mega Drive releases were fantastic action platformers, and the Game Gear entries were something more akin to Mega Man. I've not played the PS2 release so I can't comment on that, but it doesn't look very good. But this one is going for style. It's trying to be cinematic in a time when full motion video in a game was getting to a place where it started to look half decent. So I would say as an entry into the Shinobi franchise, pretty decent, but how does it fare as an entry into the Sega Saturn's library? I love it, and it is average. And let's be clear, average does not mean bad. I mean, it did exactly what I expected. It didn't exceed expectations in its gameplay, and I wasn't disappointed. What I will say though is the soundtrack, for the European release at least, has some tracks in it that will make it into my work playlist, and I genuinely really enjoyed the full motion video. Even though you can clearly see how it was done on a small budget, the fact that it looks as good as it does really did keep me playing. I was by no means invested in the story, but I really wanted to see what the crew had to show me next. What I enjoyed most about finally getting around to completing this though, was the pace that I approached it. I don't think I would have enjoyed it as much as I did if I'd started and pushed through in one long sitting of multiple retries. It's probably a bit of nostalgia remembering those weekdays coming home from school and only having the TV for a few hours before EastEnders starts. It's not without flaws. I think there is an inconsistency with the difficulty spike, but the mechanics are simple enough that you'll never get too frustrated. The combat is always fun with pleasing blood sprays, and even if you don't read the instruction manual, you'll figure out the moveset by yourself. Up an attack for an overhead swing, forward an attack for a jab. Though, now and again, I would perform a forward roll, which I had no idea how to pull off. I consulted the instruction manual, and there is no input instructions on how to do one. There is information on how to do an attack following on from one, which makes the presence of such a move even more annoying. I spent ages trying to figure this out. Eventually I found an old Reddit post from about 11 years ago explaining it. I haven't gone back to try this, but apparently you press up, forward, then down, which from a head to toe kind of forward arc kind of makes sense. I spoke quite a bit to this point about the difficulty, but I don't think it's to the game's detriment. For a game that you could potentially run through in just over an hour, it needs to give you a bit of a kicking to be rewarding. But where I think the game could really benefit is just with a few more mechanics of what your character can do in that playtime. which unfortunately prevents the game from having any standout features other than its design. With that said, as awkward as the levels are to traverse, they are really well designed, and I had some tremendous near-death saves that were incredibly tense, whether that be a last-minute health pickup, or falling so far off the screen that I never thought I'd be able to climb back up. It does have replayability, it's just not immediate. I will go back to it again, but maybe not for a little while. I would leave by saying it is definitely worth your time if you can find the means to play it, and it is a solid yet different entry into the Shinobi library. Whether it's worth the cost to buy it, I'll leave that up to you.